Hello, this is Graham Brown, Principal with the NextGen Advisors. Welcome to our podcast. Today I'm joined by my colleague Dr. Betty Rabinowitz, NextGen Healthcare's Chief Medical Officer and a Principal with the NextGen Advisors. Welcome, Betty.
Hey Graham, good to be here.
Last month, the FDA made a somewhat controversial decision to approve the Biogen drug Aduhelm, developed to treat Alzheimer's. As we know, Alzheimer's is a really debilitating disease affecting 6.2 million Americans. The FDA used what's called the accelerated approval pathway for this drug, meaning they allowed the drug to be approved for use without determining in advance if a true positive therapeutic effect that is clinically meaningful will be achieved, therefore demonstrating an actual clinical benefit. The accelerated pathway allows drugs for serious conditions that fill an unmet medical need to be approved based on a surrogate endpoint. The day after the approval was announced, the FDA narrowed the indication for this drug to patients with mild cognitive impairment or mild dementia due to Alzheimer's disease, according to a statement made from Biogen, the developer. A week later, 3 members of the FDA's advisory committee that recommended against the approval of Aduhelm resigned in protest. Betty, talk a little bit about what this drug is meant to do. I understand it's to help clear amyloid plaques in the brain. What are amyloid plaques, and what do we know about their connection to Alzheimer's or the progression of that disease in patients?
So amyloid plaques are the collection of the product of breakdown of proteins that naturally occur in the brain that accumulate in kind of areas that can be seen on electron microscopy of brains of patients who succumb to Alzheimer's disease or who die of other causes but are discovered to have Alzheimer's disease. And you can imagine that in a brain where the pathways and connection between millions and millions of and billions of neurons is so delicate and so fine-tuned that the collections of these tufts or plaques of protein disrupt very basic activities of these neurons, including the communication between neurons, the metabolism that occurs within neurons, and the natural repair activities that neurons are able to undertake on a ongoing basis throughout our lives. So think of it as a collection of byproducts of proteins occurring in the brain that accumulate abnormally and disrupt the function of the brain. What's very confusing about this, and this drug was shown, the surrogate end point was that the plaques reduced in frequency and existence. What's so tricky about this is that there are studies that show that there are patients with severe symptoms of Alzheimer, deep dementia, who have a very low burden of plaques in the brain, and vice versa. There are those patients with very heavy burden of plaques, amyloid 42 plaques, which is the most toxic form of amyloid, that don't have very severe symptoms. So there's something else that we don't completely understand about the relationship between the advancement, the progression of the disease, and the severity of the plaques, hence some of the controversy around this medication.
Very interesting. So clearly, the members of this FDA advisory panel, in aggregate at least, determined that there was some beneficial clinical value here and when it went forward with a narrow approval. Tell us a little bit about what's unique about this drug and what might have led to its approval.
So I think what's unique about it is the first thing is that there hasn't been another for 17 years. So the level of expectation, hope, anticipation associated with its launch is significant. And there's a community of patients and caregivers who are desperate for a ray of hope and good news. The second is that it's a monoclonal antibody platform that was demonstrated to clear these amyloid plaques in the brain. Which is different than the mechanism of action of the drugs approved prior to it many years ago. And I, in practice, was treating patients when those older drugs were launched. And I remember the excitement and hope that we had, and frankly, the somewhat disappointing outcomes of those. So I think the agency was impacted by the human need and the human crisis, and probably the hope that because the mechanism was different and they had a measurable surrogate outcome, that this would be different, that this drug warranted this early approval.
Mm-hmm. So as I understand it, part of the controversy is that it's gone through this more rapid approval process, and it may not have necessarily the endpoints that we'd be seeking. But at the same time, the annual treatment cost for this drug, Aduhelm, is expected to be about $56,000 a year. So that's a really significant cost, and certainly much higher than the drugs that are on the market now to treat Alzheimer's. So, I know as a result of that both the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, as well as different health plans, profit and not-for-profit health plans, are really debating whether they should cover this drug and put it onto their pharmacy schedule. What are some of the considerations that health plans would be looking at to decide if this should be covered?
From a health plan perspective, this is a very complex decision. On the one hand, their members are in huge need for some assistance and relief from their symptoms. The burden and the costs associated with treatment of Alzheimer's disease are enormous. So the need is completely clear, both on a human suffering perspective and also from a cost and healthcare system burden. On the one hand. On the other hand, how risky is it for a health plan to approve payment for a drug where the end point hasn't been proven? What precedent is being set where next week a cancer treatment drug is approved that costs $300,000 a year, that is shown to impact certain cancer cells but not change morbidity or mortality of the patients? This is a slippery slope in this regard. So I assume the commercial payers will follow CMS and Medicare. That is usually the course that these innovative therapeutic agents follow. And it will be interesting to see what CMS's decision is going to be. And it also depends how firmly the experts believe that reduction in plaques will ultimately be associated with reduction in morbidity, impact, disability, decline in patients with Alzheimer's.
Mm-hmm. What you raise is kind of an interesting conundrum where there might be a drug approved by the FDA for use, but no payers are willing to pay for it. And that creates this circumstance, potentially, in my mind, where you really exacerbate disparity within healthcare. Those individuals that can afford $56,000 a year for an experimental drug, or what might be considered experimental, given its endpoints haven't been proven, can access it. And individuals, the 6.2 million that are suffering from Alzheimer's, a great cohort of them may not be able to afford that annual cost burden. What are some of the other implications that you see if the drug's approved but payers aren't willing to pay?
That will be very challenging. I think what will end up happening is that it will not be used enough to actually obtain the kind of data that would ultimately support its use. Because what might happen now, if it gets approved and is paid for, that they will be able to very quickly, because of multiple therapeutic years that will accumulate quickly because of a broad swath of patients being exposed to the drug, which will prove efficacy. If there's very small numbers of patients using it, efficacy won't be proven, and it's potentially will cause a drug that has promise not to fulfill it, and that we will never collect enough data to support its broad use. So I must say that the FDA approval at this time prior to is going to be very complicated, and we will all be watching to see how this unfolds.
It feels a bit of a Pandora's box has been opened here. And I would imagine from, Biogen's perspective, this is a expensive drug to develop and bring to market. If they're not able to get the revenues that support its manufacture and production, they may realize that this isn't a cost benefit that they're willing to entertain from a business perspective. They may pull the drug if there aren't enough users that can pay for it.
And that would, I think it's a great point, Graham, that would be very, very unfortunate, because it is the pharmaceutical companies willing to make the upfront investments in these newer drugs that offers the promise for these very significant when you think of the burden of suffering of 6 million people a year, it's a staggering burden for families and communities and the patients themselves. So we definitely need this to be successful, and I hope that this the process that this has gone through won't impact the actual value and outcome of this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, normally we would have seen further phase 3 trials that are demonstrating a more clear connection between the endpoints they're seeking and a large cohort study that's showing that it's really working. From a provider's perspective, what data would you want to see before you would prescribe a drug like this? If you were in practice now, would you be prescribing it to patients, or would you wait and see?
It's a great question. So my approach to this would be to look at the safety profile first and foremost, and to really try and understand the risk-benefit ratio for the new medication. I would make any of these decisions in very close consultation, both with patients who are able to participate in the decision-making and their families, because the unknown is present here, and it needs to be a joint therapeutic decision because of the risks of the medications that aren't clear on the one hand, and the second is the question of efficacy and the disappointment that would be associated with it proving to be ineffective. So these are complex therapeutic decisions that have to be made in partnership with patients, families, and frankly their Alzheimer specialists who they invariably are seeing.
Well, and you raise an important point, because one of the challenge that I imagine is going to be placed on the provider community is this is a really unique circumstance, and there's a lot of complexity to engaging a patient and their family and their caregivers in a discussion around this, as you were just framing. And not every, really the specialists that are providing Alzheimer's care may need to really get educated on the benefits, the risks, as you're describing, to have those conversations and guide patients and their caregivers through that decision-making process. I imagine there's going to be more on this in the months ahead, and we may come back to this topic because it's been a pretty unique circumstance with this kind of approval, with the level of data being demonstrated so far. Thank you, Dr. Betty Rabinowitz, for joining me today, and our listeners for tuning in. If you'd like to listen to more episodes of the NextGen Advisors podcast, hit the subscribe button. This is Graham Brown with NextGen Healthcare. Thanks for joining us, and have a great day.